Night and a pleasant evening in London. So welcome to day 2 of the Protest and the Media Conference. I'm sure today is going to be as successful and as interesting and stimulating as yesterday was. This morning it's my great pleasure to introduce Lance Bennett from the University of Washington. I'm sure he needs no introductions. He's been one of the leading media scholars for a number of years now. For fans of old media, will remember his News, the Politics of Illusion. Currently in production, and Lance tells me it's coming out next month, is The Logic of Connective Action, Digital Media and the Organisation of Contemporary Protest. The publishers tell him it's coming out next month, so I'm sure it will all come out on time. So without further ado, over to Lance.
Thanks. Good morning. I hope we're somewhat awake. I'm struggling, as I see a few of you maybe. This is Alex and I doing our field work in the London 2009 G20 protests. You may remember those, which serve as one of the case studies in our book. We actually wanted this to be the book cover, but Cambridge decided it was going to be a bit stodgy about things. And so this is what we got instead. And one version of this had this kind of hand of God coming in, pushing the red button. And at first it was kind of dramatic, but then we thought, well, but that kind of echoes clicktivism, and that's not really what we're talking about here. So we just went with that, but I still have fond memories of this idea. So here's a scene of what we're calling connective action. As you can see, it's very populated with people in a crowd scene that eventually turned into an encampment, which was replicated in many, many cities across Spain. So the question that we ask, among others, is who are these people? How did they get here? What are they doing? How are they organizing themselves? And thanks to some friends of ours in Spain, Eva Anduiza, Camilo Cristancho, and Jose Sabucedo, who've been involved in a long-standing Europe and North American protest survey project in which people like me and my students and scholars all over the world and their students just go into these crowds and sample them. Now, sampling a crowd like this is a bit of a tricky proposition, but we've figured out a way to do it. And what's interesting is we've now compiled data on hundreds and hundreds of protests and the participants in them and what brought them there and what their protest histories are and things like that. And what's interesting is that this group was able to compare 4 more or less social movement type protests with the Indignados uprising. And the protests that they were using involve a general strike, which is a classic union social movement mobilization, 2 regional autonomy demonstrations, which are well-organized civil society and party-driven kinds of mobilizations, and a pro-life demonstration, all of which happened around the same time, within a year or so of the Indignados mobilization. And some interesting and I think pretty striking, given sort of social science survey result type findings, popped out. If you compare the 4 conventional social movement mobilizations, you discover that when participants were asked, can you name an organization that you're affiliated with or associated with, 70 to 100% of the participants in the conventional demonstrations named an organization that had a street address. And you might think, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that they have an office, they have a staff, they have resources. Whereas only 30% of the organizations named by Indignados even had street addresses. They might have had web addresses, but we're moving into an era in which can you brace yourselves, a website may be an organization. So that's a different kind of organization, and one of our questions is, what different kind of organization is it? As you can see, the average age of named organizations was quite strikingly different for the Indignados, much younger. And can you join the organization? This is interesting. We tend to think of organizations as things that have members and that you can join. Well, this is very true for the classic social movement organizations with which people were affiliated in the for comparison protests, but only 13% of the named organizations invited you to join them. Follow them, associate with them, show up at the protests, yes, but join, become a member. No, membership is so modern, and this is so late modern. And what does that mean? I'm going to talk about it in a minute. So we began tracking this interesting wave of protests, which occurred in a lot of different places, a lot of very different kinds of societies: Iceland, Tunisia, Egypt, Spain, the United States. Often a group of societies that you don't compare in structural terms, and yet the protests, while about very different kinds of shared problems, were similar in structure, similar in their organizations. And the year 2011 was so profound that Time magazine, a US dying print publication, which has had a long tradition of naming a person of the year, popes, presidents, prime ministers, Martin Luther King type social movement leaders. The protester was the person of the year in 2011. What's interesting is that this image is actually a real photograph, but see if you can guess who and where this person might be. Is this from Cairo? Is it from New York? Is it from Madrid? Turns out it's and is it a man? Is it a woman? It's an Occupy protester, a woman from Occupy Los Angeles, it turns out. So these kinds of mobilizations seem different. Okay? I'm not saying that they're entirely different. In fact, that's one of the interesting features of them. In these large mobilizations, there are union members, there are Muslim brothers in Cairo, but the crowd is able to manage their participation so they don't brand and take over the leadership of the mobilization. That's interesting to me. Crowds can do organizational work without being formal organizations. So what's the role of technology in these very different kinds of protests? And you know, let's demystify technology. It actually looks like that. Okay, it's not particularly pretty and it's not particularly elegant. So the myth of, wow, this is high tech doesn't really apply in a lot of these cases. But a lot of people have kind of floated above these protests and really had kind of empty debates. Will the revolution be tweeted? No, it won't be tweeted. So you see both sides of this, and I find these to be incredibly tedious and really unproductive kinds of discussions. The technology is part of the process. It's not the entire process. And so fetishizing a particular technology like Twitter, it seems to me to be a colossal mistake, rather than looking at the dense networks of all kinds of technology, from phone trees to Facebooks to Twitter, to custom-built platforms that help people see where they are on the map of national protest and what's going on in other places that they might want to be looking at. So we're interested in this project in large-scale digitally networked action, but there are different kinds. I mean, it turns out that conventional social movement organizations like unions, parties, and justice movements use technology too. How do they use it? How does the way in which they use it differ from the way in which Indignados or Tahrir Square protesters use it? So how are these different kinds of technology-enabled networks, how are they different? How are they organized? And what are the trade-offs among different kinds of networked organization? Trade-offs in terms of commitment of the people participating, the stability of the organization, the flexibility, the scale, the rapidity of the protests, and the outcomes. How effective are they? Is their power being wielded effectively towards certain kinds of targets? And how do we measure that? Some of this I can't go into too much detail in the short time we have, but questions will evoke explanations of how we did some of these things. So there are 3 points that I want to cover this morning that are kind of related, starting with the overarching set of questions about, are there different logics that drive different kinds of mobilization? fundamentally different organizational logics. And as you'll see, there are historic reasons why a lot of different societies are evolving into highly individuated social structures, fragmented social structures, people leaving unions, parties, civil society organizations for different reasons in different societies. And I'm going to talk about, that's the historical slide that I promised Peter I would include in the presentation this morning. And this individuation results in a personalization of politics. This is kind of anathema to old school social movement types who don't think personalized politics, lifestyle politics, is really a viable form. My argument is, well, viable or not, it's the future. It's not the entire future, but it's going to be a growing part of the future simply because of the way in which societies and political systems have produced, and economies, I think most importantly in the sort of post-industrial democracies, have produced very fragmented social structures with individuation that leads people to want to personalize their politics. They may do it in large numbers. I mean, personalized politics doesn't mean that I'm clicking on this to save the rainforest. I can personalize my politics and join millions of other people and occupy the US for a good period of time. And so what that brings me to, which I think is theoretically the most interesting part of this whole project, is thinking about communication not as exchanging messages, which is how we often think of it, the sender-receiver transmission type models of communication, but thinking about communication as an organizational process. Okay, that's a little, to me it's a challenging and been the most challenging part of thinking through this whole set of theories that we're trying to develop. Communication as an organizational process, and we'll talk in more detail about that in a minute. So first let's look at the logics of different kinds of collective and connective action. What we're calling connective action relies on personalized sharing of various kinds of content, and you know all the various kinds of content that people are sharing, that is self-motivated. I mean, the conventional rationale for hierarchical, resource-rich social movements is to induce people to join, induce people to understand their common problems and to take risks to overcome resistance and personal cost factors to join movements. The common collective action problem doesn't exist in anything like the same way in connective action because people are eager to share their personal accounts and experiences and don't feel they have to change who they are in terms of their political identities in order to join with others. So the cost and resistance factors are minimized. Risk factors may still stand in the way. I mean, some of these protests become enormously risky, as we know, and that becomes a different proposition. And how does large-scale networking occur? Through the technologies that everybody has on their phones, or most people have on their phones and computers, that enable easy sharing with large-scale networks of your personal story about the crisis, whatever your personal crisis may be. So this contrasts with collective action theories, which often deal with what's called the free rider problem, namely getting people to join costly kinds of activities which others might actually win for them. So and this is a classic organizational problem, of why should I spend my time and effort and take the risks to join in an action that others are already doing, and maybe I'll see how it's going for them and see if they win my case without me having to spend my time, effort, and take the risk to do so. The process of inducing people to join involves resources, leadership, professional organizing staff who go out and educate people, invite them to meetings where they make new friends and join organizations as members and come to take on a common identity, which is a big psychological shift. You have to think a little bit differently about yourself and your personal problem in order to join a larger, more hierarchical organization. So the networks that we're talking about here are often coalitions of organizations brokering their differences and bridging their frames And media are used. I mean, many of these social movement organizations, whether you're looking at unions or parties or Oxfam type NGOs, do use digital media, but often as a cost-saving mechanism to communicate easily with large numbers of their followers, their members. By contrast, the connective action involves individuals that are motivated, but on a personal level, not necessarily a level that involves them wanting to embrace an ideology or a group identification of the sort you find in collective action. And suddenly, networking platforms enable people to embrace easy to identify with action frames, like the 99%, that allows you to be immediately part of a we, but on your terms. You can tell your story. And the technology that enables you to share that story widely turns out to become organizational hubs. So that's how websites can be organizations. I know it's kind of hard to get your mind wrapped around that, but work on that and you can ask me questions in a minute. How effective those organizations are, those are other questions. But my offer to you is to think about technology platforms as organizational structure. And so in collective action, digital media reduce costs, but they don't transform the nature of the action network. In connective action, communication platforms and technologies actually constitute organization. So it is a transformation of the relationships among people in an organized way. So I'm going to wave my hand at this slide because it's way too early to go through all of it, but it turns out also that in addition to the classic connective action of the sort we found with Occupy, Tahrir Square, the Icelandic uprising, lots of popular protests in China using Weibo and other social technologies that are creating something of a public sphere, a bit independent of the ruling party today. In contrast to that and the other end of our continuum of collective action with organizationally brokered networks and collective action frames and all the things we're familiar with, there's a hybrid case in which organizations recognize they're now living in a world in which people don't want to be members as much as they once did because the social structures in which they live are breaking down and membership isn't a viable option in a lot of cases. So a lot of organizations, in order to maintain their issues and their progress toward dealing with their issues, take on a background role in mobilizing people. So for example, Oxfam is concerned about many things, as you know. One of them is world food and the now present food crisis on the planet. But how do you get ordinary people beyond the core of Oxfam members, which is graying, let's say? How do you get ordinary people to care about food and what other people may not even have to eat? Well, one of the things you do is you enlist the services of, say, Coldplay. And Coldplay turns out to be concerned about food and hunger as well. So Coldplay becomes a sort of a front organization for Oxfam. And at concerts and on their websites, they encourage their fans to share this concern about food and hunger with each other. So you're using an accessible, very personalized fan network for a rock band to front for Oxfam and a coalition of NGOs to promote interest and engagement with world hunger. Again, you can quibble about, is this serious, is it real, is it deep, is it effective? Those are other questions, but I'm just now trying to grasp what's happening. So there's a hybrid case in which NGOs step back, stop branding their issues and trying to own them and engaging in coalition fights with other NGOs about how to define them, and relax the terms of engagement so that people can personalize their engagement with these many, many issues that affect the planet today. Another example of this is the Robin Hood tax campaign, which has been quite an effective campaign, centered importantly in Britain. And there are hundreds of NGOs who are behind the scenes, but if you go to the campaign, it's a website. The organization is a website. And you can put your little Robin Hood cap with your postal code and see all the other people with Robin Hood caps in their postal codes and see what they have done for the campaign, because they are now telling their personal stories, as you're invited to do, to share your personal campaign profiles. Turns out that that may seem shallow, but it is now, through a combination of NGOs acting in connective terms and collective terms. They're also acting as conventional NGOs sitting at the table with government officials talking about these issues. So moving back and forth in what Andy Chadwick would refer to as a hybrid organizational form to maximize public engagement and focus their power and resources as conventional organizations. So this kind of movement, I think, is a very interesting pattern that we're seeing, and we can talk about that. Turns out that in a lot of protests, all three types of organized networks show up. And our challenge as analysts is to sort of spot them and identify them and then see how they're meshing or not meshing so well. And we've seen cases in which these different organizational types work fairly comfortably together, and we've seen cases in which they work disastrously badly together. So that's an interesting dynamic. So if you're asking yourself, why did this protest go so well? Why did that one go so badly? Sorting out these different action logics may help explain those kinds of questions. Here's the history slide, history in 3 bullet points of the last 30 years of globalization, neoliberal globalization. How did we get to this state where a new kind of action logic is emerging on a very large scale involving very large numbers of people and likely to increase its profile over the years to come? So since roughly the 1970s, as we know, we've been in a new era of globalization in which parties of the left, right, and center have generally bought into or been coerced into or induced, in the case of the United States, by campaign finance bribes into accepting basically the neoliberal global economic regime. The result of that, as I've seen in my country, has been a remarkable transformation of society in a very short period of time before my very eyes. I mean, this is something, you don't see the sweep of social change in front of you this often, this dramatically. So we now have almost no unions left, a few public sector unions, which are the new targets for union busting in the United States. We have disastrously poor paying jobs with few, if any, benefits. We have a growing ranks of the working poor who are working their 8-hour days, 6 days a week, and living at poverty or below with very few government benefits to help them out. And so the result is we have a separation of individuals from social structure and from social welfare systems of the sort that bring them into a civil society, enabling different kind of mobilization. So even in Sweden, I mean, the US and the UK lead the post-industrial world in the growth of inequality. It's just shocking, actually. And until Occupy happened, it was the dirty little secret in the United States that nobody in office wanted to talk about. But even in Sweden, which has now had 2 runs of center-right government, 50% of young Swedish voters have no party identification. I mean, Swedes are kind of shocked by this. So the same forces are happening in Sweden. Stockholm has sold its public power supply to a private Finnish energy company. I mean, these sorts of changes are routine now, but they are reflective, I think, of the profound change. So that's the short history of neoliberal globalization in the democratic North. But there are other places where personalization and individuation have occurred and technology has found its way into people's pockets and purses all at the same time. For example, a lot of authoritarian regimes, not all of them, because some of those regimes, like Saudi Arabia, are very nasty police states. But other regimes either fell asleep at the switch or felt they didn't need to worry about people having computers and cell phones and technologies as they policed the civil societies so that there was no organized opposition or very little organized opposition. Egypt being a very interesting case in which the Muslim Brotherhood was allowed to exist, and indeed their day has come as a result of that. So the authoritarian regimes produce a personalization and individuation of politics with technology attached in some cases. And then there's an interesting other collection historically. We are now racking up the number of failed states in the world at a rather rapid pace. Afghanistan is the US own induced failed state. The Congo, Zimbabwe, and there's a long list now of, depending on how you count, 40 or 50 or even 60 places that qualify as failed states. What's interesting is that while many of these states do not deliver basic public services to their people may have cell phones, or a village may have a cell phone. And there are now that center case of organizationally enabled connective action. NGOs often go into the failed states and provide basic service platforms. Not service centers staffed by service professionals, but technology platforms through which people can access banking, report violence, get healthcare advice, and lots of other basic public services that are networked personally through technologies in societies where people are quite atomized. So there are different cases produced by different causes. But the interesting thing is all of these differences are capable of connective action. So how does this personalization process work? If people are sharing a problem, they're motivated to express their own personal experience of a problem. Well, there's obviously extremely different ways you can do it. You can adopt a more familiar social movement guise and advise your friends and publics to eat the bankers. This was from the 2009 London G20 protests. The G20 Meltdown Coalition produced this particular action framing. But this is also another example of communication in the London 2009 G20 protest. This is a blogger that we became particularly fond of. We didn't even know if it was a he or a she, but it turns out her name is Lego Festo. And Lego Festo blogged about all kinds of interesting political situations in the world with no words. Her personal Lego construction was her account of this case, the death of a bystander, which you probably recall, during those 2009 demonstrations here, who was killed by police, not even one of the protesters, it turned out. And Lego Festo became very popular. Lego Festo was a guest blogger on the Put People First coalition site, which was an organizational platform and hosted by a number of NGOs. By the time we lost count, it was over 150 social movement organizations, civil society organizations, churches, NGOs, who stepped back and let the Put People First banner be the overarching frame for people like Lego Festo to communicate personally their experiences of the protest and the crisis. So I want to talk a little bit about these two things that we might call memes and how they travel. How do personal action frames or memes versus collective action frames or memes, how do they travel? And why is it that these things may travel easier online than those? Okay? These travel, but usually among the already initiated. These may travel and reach those who hadn't really thought about things yet, but this is an invitation to do so. So let's explore the sort of the classic collective action frame, Eat the Rich, one of my favorite memes. It turns out it's really an old one. It was, I think, best attributed to Rousseau during the time of the French Revolution. And so collective action frames can be very enduring, very sturdy, passed on through time, but they take more cultural work. They take theater, they take art, they take music, they take social movement organizing to keep them alive. So, and it doesn't always have to be highly ideological. Social movement organizing, one of my favorite Aerosmith albums is called Eat the Rich. And this is the title track. I can't see no humor about your way of life. I think I can do more for you with this here fork and knife. Banksy is helping do the cultural work of perpetuating this frame. There's work here. There's art going on. Eat the Rich Bar and Grill, Eat the Rich T-shirts, and so it gets passed down to a protester who is conveying that sentiment on a cardboard sign. Very different is the "We are the 99% personal meme. It says, almost everybody is invited into this big frame on your own terms. We don't care why you're upset about the crisis. What we care about is that you have a way to express how you're upset about the crisis and join with others in that expression. So this is the Tumblr, you're all familiar with that. We are the 99% blog, which sort of started this meme off very early in September of the New York occupation. It came out of the New York Assembly. Somebody had this idea. It's easy to put up a Tumblr site. It took on a life of its own. People didn't follow the instructions on the site, as you might guess. And so people wrote these little stories in all different forms, put their faces in the picture from their cell phones or their computer cameras, and hundreds and hundreds turned into thousands and thousands of these stories that were then circulated as links and as screenshots and so on to friends and others who got involved or engaged in this same process. So there's the idea of different logics of action and the idea of personalization of communication that helps these logics work for large numbers of people. But without communication technologies, the scale and the stability and the organizational capacity of these mobilizations really wouldn't exist. And so what I want to now do is get to that kind of hardest part of this whole idea, which is communication as organization, not just as the exchange of these things, which it is as well. I'm not saying that this is replacing our old conceptions of communication. It's simply adding another dimension to think about. And this isn't a particularly new idea. There are people in organization communication who are talking about communication as constitutive of organization. So this is kind of in a emerging family of theories about communication as organizational process. But what I think is interesting is to think about not just the Twitter revolution, but the live stream, the Vimeo, the YouTube, the Facebook, the Twitter, my email, our phone list, that revolution. I mean, all of those technologies interact with each other to produce different kinds of engagement for different people under different conditions. Okay? So all of those technologies are interoperating. Sometimes well, sometimes not so well. I mean, none of this is guaranteed to mesh perfectly and produce brilliant outcomes, but sometimes it does. So one thing that I can say about Twitter from our studies of Occupy, we've harvested 60 million tweets from Occupy US, which is a large data set. But the happy news is you can sort of throw statistics out the window and visualize. So the new era of big data is upon us, and happily, for me, it's a visual era that is really rich in terms of understanding the textures of these big data sets. But we drew a lot of network maps using the issue crawler tool, which some of you may know about. And this is a map of the different US cities, the 16 largest US cities, websites, just their websites, which were really rich news boards and meetings and reports from meetings, and sometimes with live stream feeds and Twitter streams coming out of them, plus the overarching coordinating sites. So there were several sites that were set up by Occupy tech activists to sort of provide the overview of who are we, what's going on here, what's going on over there. Here are resources. Here are apps you might need to download. So you could go to one of these sites and get a how to get out of jail app for your phone, things like that. So there was lots of interesting resources in this network. But every map we drew, no matter where we started drawing it, if it was from Facebook networks, if it was from city websites, if it was from the tech developer networks, Twitter turned out to be the biggest node. This doesn't mean that Twitter is an organization. It just means that it is a platform that most of the other nodes link to the most often. That's all that means. But the fact that they're being linked to that often suggests that it's doing something. So our question is, what is Twitter doing? Well, thinking about networks is challenging in crowds. It's a little bit easier if it's a nice NGO social movement coalition where you have a kind of a lead organization, other organizations feeding into it. You get a nice power law distribution that network scientists talk about. But in crowds like Occupy, you have networks of networks of networks. Very hard to visualize and represent them. We actually partnered with a guy at University of British Columbia in Vancouver, which is near Seattle, because we ran across his visualizations. He's doing cancer research. If you want to think about complex networks, think about cancer networks in the human body. Unbelievably complicated, but you need to visualize them if you're going to begin to address them in any intelligent way. And so he helped us think about this as a visualization for Occupy. So if you look at the center column, and this center column goes on, by the way, this is a very short view of the Occupy networks of networks. So this could be the network of Facebook pages, okay? Which was a kind of a not very well integrated network in real life, it turns out. And this could be sort of a network of the different sort of meta sites, say the technology networks and the overarching what we're doing networks, and the campaign network, shutting down the ports in Oakland and Seattle, those kinds of networks. And then the top one is kind of the city site. That's sort of what the city site network looks like, with Occupy New York being at a center with a lot of spokes going out from it, other sites linking in, because the New York General Assembly turned out to be giving out a lot of interesting ideas for other people to think about. But then this other and this is what it looks like from the top down, which is kind of confusing. But this is the one I like, because those connecting threads, which unevenly and flexibly connect these different layers of networks, that's Twitter. That's what Twitter does. And how does Twitter do it? Well, by hashtags that say, we're actually sending this message out to the folks in Oakland, so we're putting the Oakland hashtag on it. On the other hand, this message is going to both the folks in Oakland and to everybody who's listening in the big Occupy crowd. So we'll put the OWS hashtag on that. And these hashtags change over time and connect networks differently over time, suggesting to me that we're looking at something like organization in the crowd. So what can these kinds of crowd-organized networks do? Well, that's what we're doing with our data set of 60 million tweets, is looking to see what the dynamics of the crowd are at different times and at different locations in the crowd. So we can follow the OWS hashtag over the entire history of Occupy and look at what happens when police evictions occur, when Occupy New York occupies Obama, when all kinds of particular events happen, to see what hashtags are activated at what points in time. But we can also look at the resource flows in this huge crowd. And our proxy for looking at resource flows is the links. So something like 40, 50%, depending on the time and the crowd, of tweets contain links. And you may think that, and to me, tweets are very hard to content analyze. My hat's off to anyone who's trying to do it. But links turn out, well, they also present their own challenges, but we've come up with a coding scheme for coding the media contained in links. Now, that has transformed our understanding of media. I mean, what it has done is forced us to look very differently at online media, the hybridity of it, the multitude of different kinds of it, and the types of it in play at different times in the life of the Occupy crowd. So what we noticed, for example, is that there is a here's how they're looking at us, and here's how we're seeing the same situation dynamic. So that the two largest patterns of links are to mainstream news organizations. Guardian turned out to be very important because the Guardian took this up as a sort of headline story. So in the US even, Guardian was very important. The New York Times was important. The BBC was important. So we got mainstream media. That sorted out pretty clearly. But equally numerous were my personal account links to my blog, to my YouTube channel, to my Vimeo channel, to you know, what I saw about this same event. So there was this constant interplay in the crowd, and indeed among people who were following the crowd, like me, of, okay, here are the interestingly different perspectives on the same events that are going on in real time in this crowd. And then things would happen, such as camp evictions, mass arrests, and you would see a different shift in the link pattern and in the hashtags that would be carrying those linked resources out to people who needed them, who were calling for them. So that's where you would see surges in things like here's how you find a lawyer, here's how you find medical assistance in Boston, in Atlanta, in Detroit, in New York City. So we were able to begin channeling and tracking all these resource flows over time in response to particular kinds of events and moments in the life of the crowd. So we looked a lot at the literature on networked organization. There's a huge literature that spills across many different fields: sociology, communication, political science. And there are many schools of networked organization. And they're concerned about interesting things such as the emergence of networked organizations, the governance capacities. Elinor Ostrom's work comes to mind, who won a Nobel Prize for emergent commons governance systems around the world, to boundary maintenance, to lack of boundaries in networked organizations and the kinds of problems that not having boundaries, like Occupy, had very porous kinds of boundaries, presents by way of challenge to the organization. And the thing that we found to be in common about all these different schools of thought about networked organization is that they seem to have three core principles at the center while dealing with all of these interesting, unique kinds of questions about boundaries and memberships and governance, organization, and so on. One is they distribute resources. All organizations have resources, seek resources, and distribute resources, okay? And the resources might be reports. The police are coming down this street, maybe we should all go over to that street. Okay, well that's a valuable resource. Timely information, as we know from news studies, if the news produces such thing, is an important resource. Discourses become resources. My contribution to the We Are the 99% is a resource that I now own and can share at my discretion with others. Food, where to get food, who's cooking food tonight, those kinds of things. All organizations of a sort of stable sort also engage in reactions to short-term events. So police raids, or hey, look, we occupied Obama and he's responded to us. So suddenly you can detect that in the crowd, and that becomes a focal point. It dominates a lot of the crowd traffic. And then there's an adjustment period saying, okay, we occupied Obama successfully, let's occupy the next Democratic Party fundraiser in Washington. And the hashtag follows to Washington, and there's an occupation there. Or look, there was just a march in London for the Robin Hood tax. Let's do one here, and let's do it even better. Let's just do it naked with hats. And so that resource bit flowed through the crowd, and sure enough, a march of naked Robin Hoods occurred shortly thereafter. So you can see actual outcomes from these kinds of reactions to events. And then there's the most interesting one, which is where I think the crowd organization is at its weakest. Although we do see signs that there is this kind of behavior in crowds. Long-term adaptation and change. You're not necessarily being driven to this by particular events, although there may be precipitating events that create kind of long-term issues, like evicting the camps created a permanent long-term issue for Occupy. But we followed a number of crowds. For example, we followed the Copenhagen 2009 climate protest crowd, one of the largest environment protests in history, 100,000 or so people in Copenhagen. And there were all types of organization in that crowd. There were conventional social movement organizations and NGOs. There were hybrids who were kind of big coalitions who were trying to bring individuals to their view of the cause. And there were people who were just there seeking each other because they came as individuals, concerned individuals. There were really a lot of those. I mean, you might think, well, how many concerned individuals could there be? Well, it turns out maybe 30% of that crowd was people who showed up and then started looking for each other. What was interesting about that particular crowd, the crowd-enabled group, is that as the protest died, I mean, the event ended, and so the protest ended, the sort of resource-seeking behavior went on in the tail, the long tail of that Twitter stream that we followed out of Copenhagen turned out to start behaving differently than other parts of the Twitter distribution behaved over time. So, for example, the tail of that crowd started looking for stabilizing resources, and what they found, interestingly enough, was a blogger network, an international blogger network from all over the world who were concerned about climate issues and who acknowledged the participation of lots of individuals in the Copenhagen protest, who invited them to join their blog audiences, to comment on the blogs, to post on the blogs. And then what was most interesting about that climate protest from Copenhagen 15 summit in 2009 is that it handed off to Copenhagen 16 in Mexico the next year, and then the Twitter stream spiked up again and the Copenhagen 15 stream completely died. So that suggests to me kind of long-term adaptation and change, in effect the handing off of one crowd organization to the next, which was quite remarkable to detect and watch. Other examples of transition have not been so clean and so clear. The efforts of protesters in Tahrir Square to create a more stable and effective political organization, as we all know, didn't work out so well. It turns out that the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been sort of policed out of the protests, ended up winning the game when they competed successfully in the elections. And now the crowd is back protesting against them. So we see that kind of adaptation process. So in closing, I just want to say a few things about this. The fact that we're studying network structures and using really large data sets to do so, and network mapping, should in no way imply that we're unaware of the faces, the people who are camping and suffering abuse from the police. This is part of that process. It enables them to communicate with each other, to communicate with outside publics, and to have witnesses, which may be a hugely important part of the mobilization itself. All three types of our action networks have power in them, and the power works differently. And so power is present in all of them, but interestingly, different kinds of power are wielded in more horizontal networks than in more vertical ones. And technology is not neutral, and the sort of the final story I'll say on that is that what's interesting is that this level of emergent organization was produced with off-the-shelf technologies that are really designed for other purposes. I mean, nobody who designed Twitter or Facebook imagined it being used for these kinds of purposes. And indeed, the current emergent public sphere in China is the result of similar technologies, the cloning of Facebook and Twitter, which were not intended for political purposes, but which are now being used by crowds which contain people taking large risks, but trying to mitigate their risks by publicizing their actions to the entire nation, who follows it as a news feed because they can't watch the same news stories on China TV. So these social media have now become a more reliable and credible news source in China than, the press or television. So technology is not neutral. It's appropriated in very creative ways, but sometimes we think that custom technologies might do better jobs at certain kinds of tasks than Twitter or Facebook do. So we built, as part of another project, working ethnographically with a national group in the US of Occupy tech developers and activists, having very interesting conversations on and offline. We built a virtual assembly platform, which was centered around one of the core practices of Occupy assemblies, which was the temp check, where people signal their approval, disapproval, or lack of interest in things. And we built it to fit as well as technology could fit with existing human practices, rituals in these assemblies. And the lesson we learned, in fact, the lesson that our partners in developing this technology also learned, was that there were lots of different kinds of organization and actors inside the crowd. And this may not come as a huge surprise, but at the end of its days, as Occupy tailed off after the camps were evicted, many of those who remained were the most kind of conventional of activists, ideological, militant, long protest histories, who had a sort of prefigured vision of what the proper kind of organization should be for Occupy. And it wasn't this. It was not a virtual organization. In fact, they were never particularly happy about the level of technology being used. They thought that it was gimmicky. They felt that everybody who was a serious militant should be in the camp, should be participating in the assemblies, taking the risks, paying the price. So we had lots of interesting discussions with people who were more peripheral, who wanted to join and make it possible for others to join the crowd on a permanent basis from wherever they might be. But again, the adoption decisions were made by people who were the few remaining in the assemblies, and their model of what the proper Occupy organization was just very, very different from this much more technology-driven, crowd-enabled model. So you see in that little example how different models of organization exist in the same crowd. I mean, it wasn't our job to tell Occupy that it should adopt this. We were simply working with those in Occupy who felt this was a good idea, and then it ran aground those who opposed it as not consistent with the values and the organizational form of the movement. So what are we going to do next? Well, we're still working on the 60 million tweets. Turns out it's a lot of work, so we're still plugging away at that. But we're having a lot of fun at it. And we're producing interesting visualizations of how the crowd organization looks. So that's the big goal now, is to look at organization in these large data sets. We're doing a lot more work on power in networks, because that's fascinating, and we can take questions on that if you're interested in following it up. What does it look like in a conventional social movement network? What does it look like in a crowd? What does it look like in these hybrid networks? And how do these conflicts of different organizational structures, different organizational logics, how do they emerge, and how do they get resolved or not resolved in different crowds? And we've got lots of cases from around the world that we're looking at with that. So with that, I'm open for your questions, and thanks for your attention.
Marylebone from University of Urbino. Okay, do you hear me? I have at least 3 questions. The first is regarded to the beginning of your presentation, and about how did you measure the potential of the events you sampled to get people involved? While the second is based on a thing that you said some slides after. You said that digital media do not replace the conventional organization. And so I want to ask you if it's whether or not, based on the fact that movements still need to respect, in a certain sense, the game's rules coming from the institution they contest or with which they try to dialogue. The third is based on the fact or whether or not, at your opinion, we can see behind this kind of politics as a customization or personalization of communications and organization, a sort of lack or a reduced importance for political substance or political implications of collective action. And the last, I really agree with your perspective in your declination of social movement organization as multiple social networks or multi-strata social networks. And it could be, it seems to be really interesting to study them synchronously or taking into account with a longitudinal or perhaps with an event-based perspective to understand their meaning. Thank you.
Thanks. Those are great questions. If I can remember all of them, I'll try and address them. Measuring engagement, we did it in lots of ways, both impressionistically and more quantitatively. It turns out that you had the whole web at your disposal to do this work, and so we could look at what was happening in all the cities in real time. So we were monitoring. It was sort of like watching the news, only we were watching live stream. So we had students monitoring all of these kinds of camps and the demonstrations going on in the camps and the live stream feeds coming out of them. So there were impressionistic kinds of evidence. In fact, I noticed that I was sometimes on live stream. We had some assemblies at my university, and for the first time I saw an audience with little glowing apples sitting in front of me, much as today, only a couple of them were turned, the computers were turned facing me, and I thought, well, that's odd, this person can't be typing anything or looking at Facebook like this, and then it suddenly dawned on me, oh, I'm on TV. So this kind of process became an interesting way of just sort of getting the daily feed, if you will, of the protest. But we also developed methods for inventorying different kinds of networks. So we were able to inventory all of the technology in play in the Occupy network. Facebook pages, how active were they, how many posts did they have, how often were they updated, who could manage them, could anybody post on them, or were they more owned by the owners? Meetups, how many meetups were going on, how active were they, how many people were attending them, you name it. The Twitter streams we were collecting every day, so we knew how many tweets were going. Some days there were 1 million tweets a day. And we then could create a timeline for that with events that were going on. For the center case, the hybrid of NGO-enabled, but usually not branded kinds of actions, the Robin Hood tax and lots of other, the Coldplay food awareness campaign, those sorts of things. We actually developed a coding scheme. If you want it, you're welcome to borrow it and see if it works for you, to code all of the digital affordances on the websites in these networks, which were sometimes very large networks. So we have now a reliable coding scheme that enables us to see what kinds of technology, how interactive, is this informational, is it event oriented, protest-oriented kinds of technology. So we were able to actually inventory the richness of technology in these networks quantitatively and then correlate those outcomes with things like how much news coverage did these networks get for their campaigns or their events, how favorable was the news coverage, so on and so forth. So we could play out of that engagement level survey that we did to look at other kinds of outcome measures. And then you had one other question which intrigued me, but I've now forgotten. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Quickly, give me one more.
Yes, just the first of them is about the need for social movement to respect, in a certain sense, the conventional organizational processes.
Well, this is
whether or not is
right.
It related to the need to respect the game's rules of institutions they contest.
You know, the thing we learned quickly in looking at many different protest events is that some people
observe and respect rules, and some don't. Indeed, some people feel that rules are to be broken, and they do so. What's interesting, though, is that if you go back and, as we did, and looked at the history of the 2009 G20 protests in London, which were really big, and they kind of kicked off a cycle of similar protests that followed the G20 all around the world during that year or so of trying to manage the early stages of the financial crisis. What we learned is that in London, there was actually kind of a treaty meeting held for the different kinds of networks involved. So we had almost a natural experiment unfold for us. And the different kinds of protest networks agreed to hold their main events on different days so that they wouldn't clash against each other, which was really interesting to watch. So we got more or less pure forms of the different kinds of protest organization. As the chain of these protests went around the world, it was pretty clear that in other cities, Toronto, for example, which also had a very large protest, but it was very messy and you know, with kind of a police riot attached, there was no such agreement, and so there was lots of different kinds of protest formations that we were able to kind of begin to diagnose, begin to sort out a bit. So, and as for the targets, that's an interesting question. One of the things that fascinated me about Occupy is that they refuse to yield to press demands for what's your message. I mean, you all remember that. Is what is your demand? Well, so many things are broken, we don't have a single demand. There's so many things that need to be fixed. We have 100 demands. How about healthcare? How about better education? How about decent jobs? How about stop bailing out the bankers? How about the political parties stop being in the pockets of the bankers? Yeah, that's a starter set, but then there were a dozen more. So what was interesting was to see how Occupy decided that we are not going to prioritize demands because we're going to see which demands receive the most support, and then they will be acted on. So it was a very interesting sort of agenda setting and action model that we could watch play out from city to city. Sometimes it didn't go very well. Seattle chose, a very small group of Seattle occupiers chose to shut down the port of Seattle, which is a very busy West Coast port in the US. And this produced some conflict within the assembly, but the principle that Occupy Seattle used was, if you can get people to follow you, do it. And enough people followed enough people down to the port and made it impossible for the trucks to get in or out to unload the TV sets off the ships from China, that they closed the port down. And it turned out that that was a very controversial activity, not only with other Occupy groups who didn't always support it, but interestingly enough with unions who did not endorse it either. So the rationale for closing down the ports was in solidarity with unions who did not endorse the action. So you had all of these interesting kinds of targeting and political strategies playing out, sometimes for the better, sometimes not.
Okay. So we have a question here, then I'll come to you, Nick, and then at the back.
Thank you. My name is McNicholas. I'm from the University of Westminster. I was wondering if you can say a bit more about the concept of power. You mentioned in the end power in networks. I was wondering if you're also looking at power between networks and how these networks perhaps link or not to broader established power structures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that power is interesting because the standard way of handling it in networks is you find a coherent network and then you look at the power law of that network, and you can sort of, you know, compare the slopes of different power laws. Well, that sort of works. What we've noticed, in short, is that the sort of social movement models have very different kinds of power arrangements. I mean, that's interesting, is that as social movement coalitions broker their relations, they're also brokering power sharing among members of the coalition. So sometimes you get very steep power laws, sometimes you get relatively modest power laws, depending on how the movement itself has decided to organize power. What's more interesting, I think, in terms of a sort of a generalization, is that in that hybrid case where organizations, movement, civil society, NGO organizations step back and either create a web presence for its campaign or its issue, or enable personal network sharing through a sort of surrogate, like Coldplay, to engage personal fan networks. almost all of those networks, which we can model, have a sort of similar power law. They're sort of moderate because there's no lead organization except for maybe a website that everybody links to. But if your most powerful organization in a network is a website, you're looking at a different breed of network. So if you take the common website out of these networks and then model the power laws, they're all very moderate power laws. It's not the usual power law where the rich get richer, where one or a few organizations is dominating the action of others. So this hybrid case is a very interesting case. And then the crowd network power is a much more subjective, qualitative interpretation, because you've got networks of networks of networks that you can't model in a simple power law way. You model it in these kind of string plots, and you see that what is the power of a Twitter hashtag? Well, that's an interesting question. Some days the OWS Twitter hashtag was very, let's say, influential in the sense that it produced 1 million tweets and retweets, which meant that a large number of people were engaged by whatever was happening that day on that hashtag. And lots of things might have been happening. But you don't typically attribute power to a hashtag. So that raises a lot of interesting questions to me. Nobody owns that hashtag. So those kinds of patterns struck me as, yes, on that day, you could say that that hashtag behaved as a power law might behave, but it's not a human agent. So whether we want to begin attributing power to technological artifacts, I don't know. I guess not. So this raises very interesting questions. I mean, the subjective interpretation about Occupy power was that it was incredibly dispersed, and it flowed from place to place. But I can say more specific things about Occupy power at the end of the game as the networks tailed off, which was that the people who could have adopted technology that some of Occupy's own tech developers felt would kick the movement back up again refused to. That struck me as a fairly clear and fairly concentrated show of power, and I can identify who did it. Not that I want to, not that I have particular feelings. I just find it interesting that at that point we could actually identify a very small number of known people making clear decisions that looked to me like concentration of power that might have been in violation of some of the earlier spirit of the overarching Occupy ethos. So, yeah.
Nick? No, it's... And then the lady at the back.
Okay. Nick Couldry, Goldsmiths. Thanks for is this on? Are you sure it's on? Thanks for a tremendously interesting and clear talk. I mean, I made masses and masses of notes. As I read you, there are two broad forces you're picking out. One is the increasing personalization of politics, and the other is the emergence of new types of network actors. And the way you presented it, at least, was those two are broadly convergent. So I'm more interested, perhaps, to put a counter view of the potential differences and maybe tensions between the two, and I just want you to see what you think of this. First of all, just a clarification. As I read it, the personalization predates the new types of network actors, because if you take an example, one thing that struck me about the Iraq War protests, which was pre-social media, was that they also had this powerfully personalized slogan, not in my name, not in our name. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That was new at that point, and strikingly new, but it was pre-social media, so it came from somewhere else. But so they're slightly in different phases, but that's obviously fine. However, another side of personalization, the easiness of joining big campaigns, is that it's equally easy to walk away. There are no costs in not being part of it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in how you see network actors of these new sorts mitigating that risk. It could be that the churn doesn't matter because more and more people come and it's just the overall flow that matters, and we shouldn't be so concerned about individual engagements. But at some point, if we're looking at building transformative politics, presumably levels of churn do start to matter, and that relates to the third level of organisation in networks, the long-term adaptation, which, as you admitted, is difficult. So it struck me that could be an area where the negative side, the personalization, starts to feed into real practical problems for actual networks.
Yeah, thanks. Good questions. So let's just go, but yes, personalization precedes this. And so in a way, what happens is that people are cast adrift from their ordinary ways of making politics, doing politics, and begin looking for new ways to do politics. And then technologies appear that kind of work. I mean, not perfectly, they're not designed for it, but they kind of work. And web design skills are becoming common. I mean, every kid can build a website now. So the level of tech, we had a grant that I shared with our computer science faculty at my university to build platforms for various civil society organizations. And we decided to cover the spectrum from the voters of Washington State to Occupy and to the Tea Party. So we had a rather interesting mix of things. But what we found was that the level of tech skills in Occupy was quite extraordinarily high. They just lacked a few of the skills that our programmers had to build this kind of platform. But they could build a website that had a lot of functionalities and a lot of affordances and gave people lots of coordinated actions. So to backtrack that, it turns out that those kinds of skills were available during the global anti-war protests. The social media revolution hadn't yet happened, but very sophisticated websites. So one of the ones that I studied way back when I started getting interested in this was the Stop the War UK website, which in one of its incarnations, it's had many, but in one of its incarnations was rather like a computer dating site. So, okay, there's going to be a really big demonstration. We want 1 million people in London. Who do you feel comfortable going with? Would you like to go with other church ladies from Sussex? There's a bus that's going to be leaving downtown Sussex at 10 o'clock in the morning that'll get you there. Would you like to go with young communists from Oxford? There'll be a bus at Oxford Station leaving. And so, you know, I began seeing this level of technology even in those early days. And then we did a survey of U.S. protests, Washington, D.C., New York, and Oakland, on the anti-war marches. And what we found in our study was that the people who were sort of least centrally, least isn't the right word, the people who were most likely to be using digital media and to be sharing information with their friends on digital media, and in those days it was email lists primarily and websites. Those were the two things. So it was primitive, but it was nonetheless important, that the high users of digital media who were highly engaged in the protests were not centrally members of official membership organizations. So that was interesting to us. They knew people in those organizations, so they weren't outside of those networks, but they weren't centrally identifying themselves as members. In fact, even more interesting was that the most high technology users in those anti-war protests were people who were not in the peace movement per se, but who had multiple histories of activism on different issues. So multiple issues, high technology use, and they were the ones most likely to be networking somehow through even primitive technologies with their friends on a personal level. And so that's sort of how we figured that this protest scaled up. As we traced the origins of that protest, it was to the European Social Forum in Florence the year before, August, I think it was the year before. So you got a protest in something like 6 months that mobilized, however you count, 30 to 60 million people in 60 or 70 countries around the world in 6 months. I mean, so that's a pretty, rapid mobilization on a large scale. So there was some digital media, if not social network use in there. In terms of personalization, leading people to bail from these movements, sure. I mean, we are living in the opt-in, opt-out age. We are not members anymore. There are some of us who want to be members, and there are some old folks like me who still are members because we still live in that society. So we still have the residue of the modern social structure for aging folk, and we have the emergent network society that Castells has discussed so often for younger netizens, if you will. And so why would we worry? The question is, why would we worry? I mean, there's a model of social movements that involves commitment, solidarity, organization, membership, and what Charles Tilly referred to as WUNC, unity, worthiness, numbers, and commitment, or not in that order, but WUNC. which I love as his model of the classic social movement. Well, you know, the unity and the commitment may be less now, but it's maybe balanced by other features such as, and I'm going to wax Latourian for just a second, technology is an actant in these networks, which means that the technology can always find you. Even if you decide I'm taking a break, the technology keeps reminding you that this network is there waiting for you to get back in. So you might be a member of Oz or Move On or Startup or Get Up or whatever. But so maybe you ignore 90% of all the emails you get, and then suddenly one day you're going, I'm going to get involved in this because this is a really important cause for me personally. So the flip side is the technology doesn't forget who you are. And there are technological agents, and they're not always nice ones. I mean, there's very bad technology that doesn't forget who you are too. As the current leak in the US suggests that we are probably, all of our phone calls have been monitored by, unhappily, by my government for some time now. And that while they say it's for our own protection, we've all read George Orwell to know that that's what they always say. That's what they will say. So, you know, the technology is at work when we're sleeping.
Yeah.
And how that balances out, I don't know.
The lady there, and then centre front.
Right. Hello, Ing Tin Zhang from Royal Holloway, University of London. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm from the discipline of information systems, so it was very interesting to hear about you talking about technological platforms being organizational forms, the affordances of digital media. And I was actually going to ask about Latour's actor network theory when you were talking about the power of technology.
Could you speak a little more? I'm having a little
trouble. Right, yeah. I was just saying that it's interesting to hear you talk about the affordance of digital media. And I was going to ask about the actor network theory by Latour when you were commenting on the power of technology, etc. So I wonder if you could elaborate on the affordance of actor network theory on the kind of connected action that they were talking about, the sort of network action. Latour didn't intend it the theory to be applied specifically on digital networks. It applies to all sorts of life, but it seems to me there's a strong connection there. So that's just number one question. The other one is about China. I'm from China, and I've been following cyber activism in China for some time. You gave quite a bit of examples about China. One of the challenges of looking at cyber activism in China is that it's got a transient characteristics in the sense that the events, it's driven by events. It comes and goes in waves. And it's not necessarily connected to demonstrations or social movements as in Western democracies, right? So then the question as a researcher is that, fine, it's interesting to talk about all this, what's happening online. The question is, what's the change, what's the social change, what's the impact of cyber activism? How do we prove that all this activities happening online is actually connected to maybe institutional change? Can we actually argue that it's a civil society emerging? Can we argue that it's an expansion of civic sphere? Or is it all we can talk about that's happening? And that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, two more great questions. I'm going to do the last one first, so I'll forget the first one this time. I don't know enough about China to pronounce that there's a public sphere emerging here, but I do know some indicators. Let's say I know enough that I see indicators. One indicator is that a marketing study by Nielsen, of all people, in China to look at social media use patterns showed that, well, yes, 80-some% of Chinese social media users are doing what the media were intended for them to be doing with it, namely talking to their friends and shopping and things like that. 73 or 4% were actually using their Weibo accounts, for example, as news feeds. So they were tracking news. Now, it could be pretty narrow kinds of news. That wasn't clarified in these questions. But more credible breaking news stories are happening on Weibo than happening in the Chinese press, according to the surveys that I've been able to find. So suddenly you've got an interesting dilemma of a system in which the state wants to control communication, and indeed has controlled communication, and now through this accidental, unintended use of these technologies, something else is happening. And there's, I'm sure, a very big debate inside the party right now about what to do about it. I mean, there has been a declaration that they will identify users by their real identification and location, and that certainly must send a shockwave and a scare through the social media user population. How actively the government is going to do that policing, we don't know yet. In terms of how effective these protests have been, the evidence is anecdotal, but there are several examples that suggest that real outcomes have happened. So the Ningbo chemical plant that you, I'm sure, know more about than I do, was an interesting online protest that involved high volumes of Twitter users sending interesting icons, because there are certain rules. I mean, you will be filtered if you send certain kinds of messages or attack certain officials or make certain kinds of political statements. But so suddenly the graphic representation of the feelings of the people in Ningbo through artistic renderings of children and loving Ningbo went viral on Twitter and were shared widely through the Chinese population, the end result of which was the Central Party visited the local party and had a meeting at which it was decided that the local party would not, as far as I know, build this chemical plant. So those are some anecdotal examples. How common they are, what strikes me as more important is that the everyday lives of people are now being, really informed by social media in all kinds of ways. So that's interesting. In terms of the affordances, we've got an inventory that you can look at, sort of any political website, and we have some 40 different affordances that can be measured and observed. And then, so we give a score for each website, whether it's an Oxfam website or a campaign site like the Robinhood tax site. How many of what kinds of affordances does the site have, and then what's the density of those affordances across an entire network? So we can look at particular affordances distributed over a network, types of affordances across a network, get network scores, and then see how the network performs in terms of various kinds of political outcomes. So that's the model we're using. And it's a lot of labor, involved, but once you get all the coding done, it's fabulous, liberating, and fun.
I think this will be the last question now. We're eating into coffee time, and we've taxed Lance enough, I think.
Okay. Pete Goodwin, University of Westminster. I was interested in the historical discussion. Yeah.
That slide.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I told you I would be, and I liked it. But what interested me was, as well, was where it began and history before then. Yes, there was history before neoliberalism. Yeah, and well, it's difficult to believe, shock, isn't it? Yes, and I suppose what struck me was your difference between connective and collective action and your hybrid. I like that. But what struck me is that your model of collective action was very much, top-down, not very spontaneous. And there is a model of, which once upon a time we used to think of as collective action, but perhaps was anticipations of connective action, which is the great spontaneous movements, yes? Uh-huh. And I'm thinking about the sort of things, say, that Rosa Luxemburg wrote about in the mass strike, writing about the strikes in Russia in the 1905 revolution. Or I'm thinking about the May events in France. And because I was talking with someone about how long did it take, I looked it up. And from the first strike at Sud Aviation, yeah, to, so it is said, 10 million people being on strike in France, was about 10 days. Yeah? And that wasn't organised by the unions centrally, because CGT, Force Ouvrière and so on were opposed to it. Yeah? So we do have these examples, I mean those are very big ones, of, in one sense, rather traditional, yeah, from today's point of view, collective action, but displaying some of the characteristics of connective action that you take. Or I mean, one other example would be some of the things in the, dare I say it, the student movement that probably both you and I took part in, where, for instance, over the invasion of Cambodia and the movement throughout, you know, universities in the States that resulted in the shootings at Kent State and so on. There are elements of you know, this word spontaneity and of spontaneous action. And I suppose the question I would ask you is, one, would you include those as examples of connective action rather than collective action?
Yeah, I mean, I'll circle back to what I think is sort of interesting about this moment, but a personal anecdote comes to mind in my own college graduation ceremony, which I very nearly boycotted, but my family wanted me to do it, and so I thought, okay, I'll do it. And the Secretary of Defense, who was managing the Vietnam War at the time, was the speaker. I mean, horrific. So suddenly in the crowd, many of us wearing black armbands, and suddenly in the crowd, I noticed signals from over there. And so, okay, so then I told all of the friends sitting around me, this is the moment, we're going to have a walkout. So okay, suddenly half of the graduating class, my graduating class, stood up and left during the speech from the Secretary of Defense. So there was an interesting moment of connective action. So we circled around and met behind a building on campus, and I talked to one of the people in the group from over there, and I said, that was really brilliant. You know, we shouldn't have sat through that whole thing. He said, oh, well, we didn't do it because of him. We did it because our degree program didn't grant us the proper degree. And I said, oh, that's great, okay. So these kinds of things have probably happened throughout history, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. But I guess what I find interesting about the present moment is that they're happening so often and becoming a sort of a protest modality of choice, as sort of preferred over other kinds. And I'm sure there have been examples of this. I'm not trying to put a historical boundary on the form of it, but I do think that the capacity for networking and sustainability, if you will, as networking communication technologies become agents to remember who we were and how to find us again, and reorganize us. So, for example, the transition from the European Social Forum to the worldwide anti-war protests in 2002, 2003 was not only rapid, but the technology itself morphed. I mean, there were discussions in the European Social Forum from my sources who were there that basically said, well, wait a minute, we're a social justice network. We don't necessarily want to lose our focus and become an anti-war network. And many who were more trusting in the technology said, it's not going to change a thing. It's just something else we can do. There's 500,000 of us who managed to be here in Florence, and there will be millions more of us who will protest the war, and all we need to do to make it happen is alert our networks that this is the event, this is the time, this is the theme, you know, no war, and it happened. So I think that the flexibility, the multiple targeting, and the preference for this kind of protest is both growing for sociological reasons, but is also enabled better by technology. Not that it's new, not that it hasn't happened before.
So I only remains to thank Lance for a very, very stimulating talk. Thank you. And so coffee is downstairs.